Hello everybody. Last weekend we saw the announcement from Number 10 and learned that Britain was moving to a different phase of lockdown, and one that it's hoped would begin to reintroduce some freedoms, so return to work for instance for those who can't work from home, and some new permissions around exercises and socialising and some sport, etc. Now, I know for those of you in Year 12 and Year 13, there wasn't the clarity on when we will be returning to school that you were hoping for. As soon as those details are available, you'll be the first to know. But I know that there's still some uncertainty, and more resilience is going to be called upon to face an extended period that perhaps we were anticipating a return sooner. But I think for you and for the public at large, generally, these were smaller steps towards normality than we'd hoped. And whilst allowances to play sport with others sounds like an answered prayer, in reality, I'm not sure that the opportunity to play golf or go fishing is exactly open season and fun for you in northwest London. But looking on the bright side, as we must, the chance to meet up with a friend in the park to chat or kick a ball is a big bonus. Plus, if we start to get some warmer weather, just being able to go and spend the day in the park without having to worry about making it look like exercise is also a breath of fresh air. And we are, in London, very fortunate in that we're never far from some green space. If you look on Google Earth and fly above where you live, you don't have to go very far before the first public green spaces appear. This might be a great time to go and explore one or two that you've never been to. We are particularly rich in parks and open spaces in London. 400 in the city alone and over 1,000 in Greater London. We've got the 8 royal parks. I wonder if you could name how many you could name. 4 is doing well. I'll pause whilst you think. Hyde Park? Did you think of Hyde Park? Regent's Park? I think those are the easy ones. St James's Park, Richmond Park, that's 4. What else is there? Green Park, Kensington Gardens, Greenwich Park. I wonder how many of you remember the 8th or even knew the 8th. Do you know it was Bushy Park? Of course you did. Outstanding. Now, together those parks cover about 5,000 acres of some of the most expensive real estate in the world, land that used to belong to the church. Vast swathes of the country belonged to the church, but those royal parks were taken back by the crown after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century and used as private hunting grounds. Charles I, for example, built an 8-mile wall around Richmond Park to keep his deer in so that he could hunt them without them running off. And you can see the descendants of those deer to this day. In fact, this is a perfect time to visit Richmond Park if you can get there, as it's closed to traffic and closed to cyclists at the moment. If you've ever been to Richmond Park on a weekend, you'll know that it can feel a bit like the Tour de France down there, but not at the moment. And a friend who lives nearby says it feels like you're deep in the countryside at the moment, which is beautiful. Now, nearer to home for us in northwest London, we have Hampstead Heath, of course, which is not, as some of you might have thought, a royal park, but is rather a common, like a Wimbledon Common or Clapham Common. And common land was a thing that came to Britain with the Normans in 1066, and the landowner would keep a piece of meadowland for his workers to graze their animals on. And they would share it and sort of scrape out a living. But it also became a sort of centre for community as people shared that land, and rituals around the changing seasons and the harvest and so on were centred on those commons. And it's where the idea of the village green comes from. But as time went on, of course, more and more of that land was enclosed, privatised, literally enclosed by hedges to keep sheep enclosed. And the hedges that we now think of as being a quintessential part of the English countryside were at the time a real scar, a painful memory of land, access land that was lost, public land that was lost. And a lot of people protested and were dismayed by this for a very long time. And in fact, it was 1866 that Parliament passed the law protecting common land for public access in places like Hampstead Heath to keep them open for us to enjoy. I know many of you have been. In other cities in other parts of the world, the parks have taken on new importance as places of refuge and sanity and refreshment. In New York City, the famous park, of course, is Central Park. It is designed by someone who'd been a sanitary officer called Frederick Olmsted. He was a sanitary officer during the American Civil War, and he designed that wonderful oasis in New York City. And his vision was that it should provide an occasional contemplation of natural scenes which was favourable to the health and vigour of men. Perhaps public spaces will become even more valued as being favourable to the health and vigour of us all as we emerge from lockdown. We might start to think about how these public areas and public facilities might look moving forwards. Do we need to start building in places to wash our hands, perhaps? On a related note, I've long thought that were an alien to visit London on a human species fact-finding mission, he might reach the conclusion that human beings rely on regular access to coffee to survive, whereas access to a toilet was an infrequent luxury. Might post-COVID see public toilets return to the city? Who knows? During the 19th century, the Victorian period, most of our city was being developed as we know it. And in those days, even though it wasn't that long ago, public health ideas were still pretty strange. There was a great fear of fumes, apparently, not car pollution, obviously, but fumes that came from the earth called miasmas that would seep up from the soil and poison us and cause disease. And it was to keep those miasmas sealed in, as well as for other sensible reasons, but partly to keep those miasmas sealed in, that the streets were paved with flagstones. The flagstones were to keep the miasma out. For city builders in 19th century London, cracks in the road or in a wall were a real cause for alarm, not least because of it might mean a structural weakness, but because it might let the miasmas in and cause disease. And London wasn't the only place in the mid-19th century where there were some pretty full-on public health concerns. There was a bubonic plague that tragically started in China in the 1850s that spread to every continent on the planet and led to 12 million people dying, 10 million of which were in India. It was only in 1960 that the World Health Organization drew a line underneath that plague and said that it was over. The casualties had fallen to 200 a year, and it was deemed to have finished. It was called the Third Plague, the first of which being in the 6th century Byzantine era, and then the second was the Black Death, of course, the European plague that claimed a third of the European population. And if we think that life in lockdown is extreme, for us, the measures to combat that third plague included burning down parts of the city. He literally razed the block, perhaps trying to reproduce the Great Fire in 1666 that ended that period of plague for us in London. But in the 19th century, it was discovered that rats were the culprit of the plague, and then there was a huge global rush from inventors and engineers to invent new ways to rat-proof houses and block drains and create barriers and so forth. It might be that post-COVID, we all rethink how cities are planned and built. There's talk in London of new investment, significant investment in making our city more walkable and cyclable, closing roads around schools to traffic to encourage journeys that avoid congestion on public transport, and as well as pollution from cars. Maybe we'll see laws passed to legalise the use of electric scooters on the road, which will then open up public hire schemes like we've seen for electric bikes, and that will change the face of our city. Maybe the cities of the future will be more decentralised and more spread out, with hospitals and other essential services spread to make them easier to get to, with travel more limited. We've seen on our doorsteps, local high streets have been taking a blow for a long time, and particularly recently, but that corner shops and 24-hour grocers, we've been realising the value of them more and more, as they're often better stocked than the supermarkets, it seems, and less of a hassle to get to, and with less queuing. And elsewhere in Europe, there have been some truths revealed by the pandemic that were existing before, and then it took something like this to make it clear what was happening. And in central Amsterdam, for instance, people living in central Amsterdam have reported that since tourism has all but stopped, suddenly there's no neighbourhood, there's no city, there's no community, and it's taken the pandemic to reveal that, how the use of the city space had been changing for a long time. Now, in the first of these lockdown assemblies back in March, I talked about the ways that things might be better after COVID-19, and one of them was about the way that it might make us rethink the way that we use our city, about how we reevaluate which journeys are essential, how we travel, whether we travel to work. Lots is being written about this, and people are looking ahead more and more to what life after lockdown will look like, and not necessarily wanting everything to go back to how it was before. Now, there was a YouGov survey you may have seen, which found that that fewer than 1 in 10 people questioned wanted a full return to how things were before. Now, the wording "full return" is obviously key here. It means that the findings of this survey are a little less black and white than it would first seem. But it does make us wonder, does a survey like this reflect that people will always favour change over status quo, or does it reveal that when people are given a chance to stop and reflect, as they have been in an unprecedented way during this lockdown, then they become more aware of things that were suboptimal before, and it required this pause to reveal them? Whatever the case, it appears that the city and our lives in it will not be the same as they were before for quite some time, if ever. And it is perhaps an unprecedented opportunity, certainly in our lifetime, an opportunity for us to think about how we'd like things to be and what our post-COVID resolutions will be. What kind of city will we be a part of building as we adjust to our new normal? Perhaps the perfect place to do this blue sky thinking might be the local park a few streets away, maybe with a friend to bounce your ideas off. Rest assured, when we do get back to school, this will be a question that we'll be asking you. How will you have changed? What attitudes will have changed for you? What kind of city would you rebuild? What lessons will your generation, who will after all be the generation that helps shape that city in the years to come, what lessons will you have learned from this whole thing? And how can things change for the better? What will London look like when we all come back out into the light? On that note, all the best, and see you soon.